welcome to the talk. What I'm going to talk about, well, first of all, I am a neurologist. I've been interested in cannabis medicine for about 20 years now, and I helped the first licensed medication come into get its license, called Sativex, which is a mixture of THC and CBD and used for MS spasticity. That's 20 years or years ago, and then being up to date about 4 or 5 years ago, I was involved, as Anna kindly said, with the first license for a little boy called Alfie Dingley. And as a result of that, I don't take credit for it, but as a result of Hannah Deacon's campaign, the law was changed on the 1st of November 2018, just a few months after Alfie's license. And that enabled doctors on the specialist register, we'll come to this later, to prescribe cannabis in the UK. It's been not exactly a fast start to prescription, but we have got a couple of thousand, about 2,500 people prescribed now. So what I'm going to do for this chat, which is the maximum of an hour, probably a bit less, 45, 50 minutes. I'm just going to spend the first half roughly just going a bit through cannabis, as I'm not sure about the knowledge of the audience and how knowledgeable you are about cannabis generally, its medical applications at least. So I'm going to go a little bit about cannabis. Hopefully there's something for people to learn there. And then the second half, I'm going a bit more practical about how, once you are a doctor, and I think most people on this are medical students, there may be some doctors as well, how you might go about actually prescribing it when you qualify, which isn't easy, but we'll go through some of that. So that's what I'm going to talk about, and I'll get on and do it. Now I've got to do the only technical bit now is to show my screen, which I will do here. And hopefully we can do a slideshow from beginning. And is that okay, Anna? I don't want to start talking if it's not on the screen. Can you see that all right?
Yeah, I can see that. Looks great.
Perfect. Okay, let's have a quick look at medical cannabis. And I've got to be fairly fast this first half of the talk, because there's an awful lot of very interesting things about cannabis. The history of cannabis is absolutely fascinating. And then there's not just the social history, there's the recreational history, there's the medical history, and there's the spiritual history as well, because it's used in many religions as part of religious ceremonies, if you like. But let's have a very brief look at the history of cannabis. And it started about, well, the plant's been around for millennia after millennia, but its sort of human application origins were first described about 5,000 years ago in China, as it says on this map. And then we know fairly soon thereafter, it spread a little bit eastwards to the rest of China and a little bit into Southeast Asia, and then southwards to Indian subcontinent. And then more recently, but still BC, into the Middle Ages, into Middle East, rather, and then Europe, and then more recently in the scheme of things, but still 500 or 600 years ago, across the Atlantic to North and South America. So that's its spread. And this guy here is the first known proponent of medicinal cannabis, if you like. He's called Shen Nong. He was the so-called father of Chinese medicine. He was the first descriptor, if that's the right word, of acupuncture. And he first described the use of cannabis for medical purposes nearly 5,000 years ago. So it is actually the oldest medicine known to man. So some of the people recently who say, well, we don't know enough about this, it may, at a health select committee, somebody at the health select committee who I was giving some evidence said, well, this might be the next thalidomide. We don't know enough about it yet. Well, I don't know quite what else he wants with 5,000 years of history. So it's got a long history as a medicine. And indeed, up to the 1920s, it was very much accepted as a medicine. Just a couple of quick examples. This is still 1500 BC. This is Aber's papyrus, and that's a description using cannabis as vaginal suppository for pain related to menstrual cramping. So its early usage was mainly around pain, but also around epilepsy. So epilepsy use is not new either, and also use around anxiety. It was described as a totally accepted part of the medical process, if you like, up to the 1920s. This may have heard of Nicholas Culpeper, who was described in his Herbal, 400 herbs and their uses. And of course, we have to remember that medicine up to the turn of early 20th century was very much a botanical subject. Herbs were mainly used. That was the basis of medicine, was herbs, and then more latterly surgery, of course. But it's a totally accepted herbal product. First introduced into the UK, really, by this guy called William Brooke O'Shaughnessy in the 1830s, who was an Irish physician who worked in India, saw it as being used in the local population and brought it back with him to the UK when he returned, and it was sold as Squire's extract. And again, just to confirm, it's a standard part of medicine. This is William Osler, I'm sure you will know, is so-called father of modern medicine. He was recommending it in this circumstance for migraine in his Principles and Practice of Medicine. It was used, Queen Victoria is said, I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a nice story. Queen Victoria was said to use it, and certainly Sir John Russell Reynolds, her personal physician, recommended its use mainly for pain. She's meant to have used it for menstrual pain. And there we are, just one quick slide of more than 100 separate things were listed that could be helped by cannabis in the US pharmacopoeia around the turn of the last century. It was given to children even for helping them sleep at night. So, it was a totally accepted part of medicine. And then this came along. This was the start of the rot, if you like. At the time, herbal products were getting a little bit out of fashion at this point because of the emergence of the new pharmaceutical industry, and it became fashionable. I think fashionable is the right word, actually, for single molecule pharmaceutical products to be the only thing of value, and herbs were beginning to be sidelined as a bit yesterday's news. So with that general trend in medicine, then this opium conference came along, and the Egyptian delegate, for reasons only known to the Egyptian delegate, stood up and said he wanted cannabis included in the list of controlled products. This was a conference mainly about the control of opium. And he said that hash was at least as harmful as opium, if not more so. There was no counter argument because that was unexpected, and it got onto that agenda, and it was approved, and it's been sort of lumped together with things like morphine, opium, heroin, cocaine as a very dangerous drug of no medicinal value ever since, to be honest. This guy didn't help. Harry Anslinger, he was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. His counterpart was J. Edgar Hoover, the commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. He joined forces with J. Randolph Hearst, a newspaper magnate. Between them, they had a very successful anti-cannabis campaign. The reason for which, from Harry Anslinger's point of view, is he wanted to preserve his budget because prohibition was finishing, and he wanted to keep his budget and keep his staff. So he thought, what shall I have as a campaign that will persuade the federal government to give me more money? And this is all entirely true story. And he came up with anti-cannabis called anti-marijuana campaign, which is very nasty, very racist. It was anti-Mexican, anti-black, and thoroughly unpleasant. And it was really the strength of the US culture, if you like, and Randolph Hearst and his newspapers. So I should have turned my phone on to silent, shouldn't I? So bear with me while I switch it off. It's a nice ringtone. So they had a very successful campaign, and I'm sure you'll remember some of the dreadful things they came up with were just completely fictitious. There was no evidence, no science behind that, no evidence base for this campaign. I'm sure you'll remember the Reefer Madness. It's actually available on YouTube. I saw it myself about a month ago, and it's so awful it's worth watching. But really, cannabis from then onwards, and we're talking about the early 1930s, has been sort of vilified in a sense by the establishment as an anti-establishment drug. It's a drug of a gateway drug, is very common, totally inaccurate. And I think that's part of the difficulty of getting accepted as a medicine, because particularly the older generation of medics have had this anti-cannabis propaganda forced upon them probably all their lives. And surely this product can't be of any value as a medicine. So I think we've got a bit of stigma and social appropriation to overcome. Anyway, all this, the change of pharmaceuticals and the campaigns all led to the UN Single Convention of Drugs in 1961, which lumped cannabis as a Schedule 4 and Schedule 1 drug, particularly liable to abuse and produce ill effects, and such liability is not offset by substantial therapeutic advantages, as the phrase goes. And that was the precursor worldwide to the various countries that then put into place their Misuse of Drugs Act, and ours came into force in 1971. And it was not until last November 18 that that act and the regulations that goes with it were changed to allow prescription of cannabis. So we've only very recently come a long way to reversing 80 years of propaganda, to be honest. Okay, I'm going to change, this is very fast, but I'm going to change the topic to just to 3 or 4 minutes on the endocannabinoid system, because cannabis works in our bodies through the endocannabinoid system. And it's not something that really isn't taught very much at medical schools, if at all. I'd be interested to see from the medical students on here whether you've actually heard anything about it or not. It's surprising you haven't, because it is the master controller of all neurotransmitter systems. And let's look at that in a bit more detail. We've known for about 20 years now, 25 years, 30 years, that every vertebrate has an endocannabinoid system. And every vertebrate has cannabinoid receptors, excitingly called CB1 and CB2. And there's almost certainly there are more, probably 3, 4, or 5, but not yet formally labeled. CB1 receptors are largely in the brain and the spinal cord, but they're also all over the body, in the immune system, the heart, lung, bladder, as it says there. CB2 receptors also in the brain and the spinal cord, but they're mainly in the immune system. And we now know there's natural ligands to these receptors, anandamide and 2AG, that link to those receptors. And what they actually do, forgive me if I'm if there's any neuroscientists on the call, you can better switch off for a few minutes because it's going to be highly simplistic. But if you remember the presynaptic terminal releasing the neurotransmitter, whatever it is, there's about 20 neurotransmitters in the body. Glutamate or GABA is listed here, but it could be any of them. The neurotransmitter is released, it crosses the synaptic cleft, it links with the postsynaptic neuron through an influx of calcium, then the signal carries on down the postsynaptic neuron. If you think about it, that system needs switching off, it needs modulating, it needs toning down, if you like. And the switcher offer, the toning down, the feedback loop, is the endocannabinoid system. And anandamide in this slide is made on demand. As soon as it detects the influx of calcium, it makes an anandamide. Anandamide crosses backwards across the synaptic cleft to link to the CB1 receptor on the presynaptic terminal. And as soon as it does that, it switches off the neurotransmission, basically, by promoting an efflux of potassium and an influx of calcium. And that's simple. And then as soon as anandamide has done its job, it is metabolized. So it's an on-demand system, and it is simply there to modulate, adjust our own neurotransmitter system. So it's a sort of master controller, if you like. Anandamide is, there's 2 of them, 2AG and anandamide. Anandamide is Sanskrit for joy or bliss. I won't go through this in detail. Suffice it to say, it is an agonist of the CB1 and CB2 receptors and other receptors. So the story I'm telling is not quite as simple as we might make out, because the endocannabinoid system also works through other receptors. Incidentally, anandamide is contained in chocolate, which may explain a sort of feeling that some people have of chocolate. They love chocolate. It gives them a sort of feeling of, or joy or bliss is a bit much, but you know what I mean. And it's also anandamide goes up after physical exercise, a so-called runner's high, which I've never had, despite the fact I do running. So there must be something wrong with my endocannabinoid system. But that's what it's meant to do in terms of interaction with the CB1, CB2, and other receptors. And then 2AG does the same thing. It's a bit of a better receptor agonist, a CB1 and CB2 full agonist, 2AG, and for other receptors as well. So in summary, forgive this potentially complicated looking slide, here's an anandamide and 2AG being formed. I don't think it matters for this talk what it's formed from. They go back across the synaptic cleft, they bind with CB1, CB2 receptors and other receptors like GPR55 and TRPV1. As soon as they've done their job of switching off the neurotransmission, they're broken down through FAR and MAGL into those components. So that, in a nutshell, is the endocannabinoid system. But more particularly, what does it actually do? Well, it has a role in memory, particularly. We know it has a role in extinction of old memories. Therefore, it may explain cannabis's potential for PTSD treatment. We know it impairs short-term memory. We know it increases appetite. This is the natural endocannabinoid system, not cannabis I'm talking about now. We know it has an anti-inflammatory role, quite a potent anti-inflammatory role. We know it has an analgesic role, very strongly so, mainly through other receptors. We know it has a role in temperature regulation, thermoregulation, and we know it promotes sleep, increases REM sleep. And that gives you a little bit of a hint. Some people say cannabis, plant cannabis, can't really, it's supposed to be some sort of snake oil, because you can't have one medicine that sorts out things like appetite, anti-inflammatory role, analgesia, sleep, memory, and other things on the next slide. But when you know that it works through the endocannabinoid system, and that's all it does, the phytocannabinoids in the plant also interact with the cannabinoid receptors. That's exactly how it works, or at least partly how it works. Then you can see why it should have such a broad range of functions across many different bodily systems, if you like, and that explains why it has such a broad range. Let's have a look at what else it does. It helps motor control, a role in the management of spasticity, for example. It clearly has a role in neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, reduces bladder tone, reduces motility and anti-inflammatory effects in the GI tract, hence a use in inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's. It has a role in female reproduction, embryonic implantation. And we do know very strongly that some of the cannabinoids are very anti-cancer, if you like. They have some role in controlling proliferative cell responses. So that's a big range of things that the natural endocannabinoid system does. So bearing that in mind, let's move, there are other endocannabinoid modulators in the pipeline, as it were, that we are now discovering. So over the next few years, we'll know a lot more about endocannabinoids system and the ligands and the receptors than we do at the moment. It's more complicated than I've simplistically tried to outline. So let's look at the plant. Cannabis plant. Some of you will know it, some less so. On the left is Cannabis indica, that on the right is Cannabis sativa. Sativa tends to be tropical, it tends to grow tall because it's got generally compete with tall trees around in the tropical forests and such like, whereas indica tends to be short and stubby because it doesn't compete with other plants. It tends to be in more drier regime areas like Afghanistan, for example. It's said they have slightly different medical properties. I think that distinction is going a bit out of fashion. It's said that indica is more sedative and sativa is more, for want of a better word, uplifting, creative. Generally, that's true, but it really comes down to what the cannabinoids profile is in the plant rather than exactly which species it is. So it's so-called chemovar. The chemovar describes the chemicals within the plant, and that's perhaps more important than the variety. Then there's 2,500+ different cannabis seeds, and you think, well, they all have subtly different THC, CBD, other cannabinoids, terpene profiles, so they all have subtly different medical properties. But it's not quite as easy, actually, as picking the right plant for what condition you want, because it will grow, but how it grows, what the end product is, does depend a bit on the seed, of course, but it also depends on how you grow it, what medium you plant it in, whether it's indoors or outdoors, produces slightly different varieties of the final chemical composition, how tall the greenhouse is, how close the plants are together. When you harvest, when you switch to flowering, when you harvest the flower, and finally how you extract the oil from the flower, all produce different combinations of the different cannabinoids and terpenes. So it's a highly variable, highly complicated plant. It is not just one medicine. There are many senior medics that seem to think that cannabis is one medicine and can be tested as one medicine like a pharmaceutical product. They couldn't be more wrong. There's endless thousands of different varieties. There's a whole family of medicines, not just a single product. Anyway, you plant the seed. You have a vegetative phase where the plant grows, usually in the wild, as it were, last 2 to 3 months. And then what you do, slowly the plant will flower. It's triggered into flowering by changing the light cycle. So in nature, as it were, where it gets towards autumn, when they get longer nights, 12 hours on, 12 hours off, that induces flowering. So what you do in a greenhouse or in a loft is to swap the light sequence from 18 hours on, 6 hours off, to 12 hours on, 12 hours off, and that triggers the plant to flower. And what you want is the mature flower. And what you really want is the unfertilized female flower, Sinsemilla it's called. That's because there's a much higher cannabinoid content in the unfertilized female flower than there is in the fertilized flower, certainly in the male flower. So what you want is a good quality, robust, unfertilized female flower. And that, of course, can be an end product for the recreational market. You take that flower, you grind it up and you smoke it in a joint. But for medicine, we're also now prescribing about 50% of our prescriptions are flower prescriptions for vaping. We can't prescribe for smoking, but we can prescribe for vaping, and about 50% of the prescriptions are for vaping. And we can prescribe flower in 5-gram bags usually, and the people will have to get their own vape machine and vape it. I'll come to why and everything a bit later on. But that's the one end product. The other end product is to extract the cannabinoids and the terpenes from the trichomes. They're the sticky white things we saw on the flower in the previous slide, and here they are in close-up. And the cannabinoids and the trichomes are contained in those, the cannabinoids and the terpenes are contained in those trichomes. So what you will then do, if you want an oil, say, from the plant, is extract the oil from those trichomes. There's lots of ways to do that, which I won't bore you with today. You can do it by hand because they're very sticky. You can just press the flower and the oil will come out, or you can dissolve it, if you like, extract it through butane or ethanol or supercritical CO2. That's what they do in the big commercial operations in, say, Canada. The ethanol, take that for example, you soak the flower in ethanol, the trichomes will, and therefore the cannabinoids and the terpenes will be extracted into the ethanol. You get rid of the plant material and then you gently heat up. The ethanol boils off and you're left with the oil behind. But there's lots of different ways, and the final composition of the medicine will also depend a little bit on how you've extracted it. So the final content, as I say, it depends on the strain you've grown, how you've grown it, the light, the time of the harvest, and the extraction method. So there's a lot of variability. So just thinking what you're going to get from planting one particular seed is nowhere near what you might get at the end of the process. Let's have a quick look at some of the phytocannabinoids. I'm going to do this fairly quickly. Cannabis has got a sort of psychoactive, intoxicating type label around it, but actually not that many of the known cannabinoids are psychoactive. Delta-9 THC is the main one we hear about. There's other THC, delta-8, cannabinol, which is a breakdown product of THC, and another one called THCV. They're the psychoactive ones. And let's have a quick look what THC does in isolation, as an isolate. I don't recommend using isolates, but let's have a think what it does as an isolated compound. It's analgesic, it's bronchodilatory, interestingly, which I noted I'd spelt wrong. So it's quite helpful for things like asthma, actually, a bit counterintuitive. It's neuroprotective, it's antioxidant, it's muscle relaxant, it's anti-sickness, and it's very potently anti-inflammatory. So in its own right, it has clearly a lot of useful medical properties. Let's have a quick look at its counterpart, CBD. CBD also works through the endocannabinoid system, a little less so. It also interacts with a lot of other neurotransmitter systems. It's an inverse agonist of CB2, and it's a CB1 antagonist. So the important thing to note is that if you prescribe cannabis medicine with CBD, it will tend to counteract any high of the THC. And so it's actually quite unusual for a medical prescription to get people high, because we always will combine a THC with a little bit CBD with a little bit of THC, which is worth bearing in mind. So the end result of a medical prescription is very rarely you get people high, and therefore there's very little leakage into the recreational market from medical prescriptions, because people wanting it recreationally want to get high from it. What does CBD do in isolation just by itself? It's very strongly anti-anxiety, it's anticonvulsant, it's antiemetic, it does other strange things like stimulate bone fracture healing, it's cytotoxic to some types of cancer, but it's not intoxicating. You could say it's psychoactive, but it doesn't get you high. But it's not that simple, because there's lots of other cannabinoids, and I'm not going to bore you with too much with this, but the mother cannabinoid is CBG, cannabigerol, which in sense is then broken down to the THC and the CBD. and also one called CBC, cannabichromene. In the plant, they come in acidic form. So if you can make a smoothie out of a plant, you're not going to get high from it, because the acidic precursors need to be broken down by heat or light, so-called decarboxylation, before they get to the active THC and CBD. THCA and CBDA and CBCA do have properties, medical properties of their own right, which I'll show you in a moment. So let's take just a couple of examples to show you that there's much more to the plant than THC and CBD. CBG is anti-cancer, anti-inflammatory. It has effect on overactive bladder. Glaucoma is antibacterial properties, are very useful, and is a very strong appetite stimulant. Those on the right are just the varieties you can buy that are relatively high in CBG, or buy illegally, I have to say at the moment. THCA, that's before it's decarboxylated, that's quite a useful anticonvulsant. And we have a couple of children who can't tolerate any THC, but they can tolerate THCA for their anticonvulsant properties. CBC, the other one on that list, is very good for acne and psoriasis, and also is one of the few that have been shown to have an antidepressant effect, as well as being anti-inflammatory. Let's have a look at CBN. That's the breakdown product of THC. That also is antibacterial, anticonvulsive, appetite stimulant, analgesic, etc., etc. So all the cannabinoids so far tested do have some medical properties. The last one is the varine pathway, exactly the same as the one I've just shown you, but with a varine. For the chemists amongst you, you can tell me what that is, because I have no idea, but it's another chemical entity attached to the molecule. THC VA, CBD VA, etc. One look at there is THC-V, and that's a potent appetite suppressant, very, very powerful appetite suppressant, might have a role in management of obesity, for example. It also seems to have a role in the management of diabetes, and it's one of the few that have been shown to have anti-Alzheimer's properties. So I didn't want to remember all that lot, and so I'm very happy to send these slides if drug science wanted to send them at some point. I just wanted to show that the fact that all cannabis is not just THC and CBD, it's a load of other stuff. And when we're talking about the other stuff, that's 147 of the other cannabinoids. I'm not going to go through all those because I haven't got that length of time, but you can see lots and lots of different cannabinoids, a lot of which we know very little about actually, but those we do know something about all have some medical properties. Then finally, there's terpenes, the thing that gives, when you smell cannabis on the street, you're smelling the terpenes, not cannabinoids. And there's about 100 terpenes in the cannabis plant. These are just 5 of the commonest ones. I won't go through them, but myrcene, for example, is quite sedating. So having prescribing a variety high in myrcene is quite useful if you want sedation. Linalool, for further example, is also a little bit sedative, but it has quite good anticonvulsant properties. So if you want to help a child with epilepsy, for example, in addition to the CBD, you might want a variety high in linalool, which comes, of course, in lavenders. Lemons, pine, caryophyllene is a peppery sort of spicy effect like cloves. And then, if I haven't confused you enough, there's flavonoids, they're things that give plants their color. And take that one on the right, quercetin gives a red color to tomatoes and apples. And that has antioxidant, anti-neoplastic, and antiviral properties. So you put that complexity of 147 cannabinoids, 100 terpenes, about 100 flavonoids together in thousands of different combinations, you can see that you can very quickly have a huge family of medicines with different properties. But for medical terms at the moment in the UK, it still comes down to the THC-CBD ratio. And that's what we're able to do. We have products high in CBD, we have products balanced between the two, and we have products high in THC. And we haven't got the subtlety of some of the prescriptions we can get in Canada, for example, now, and certainly in the part of the States where it's recreationally legal. Then, of course, you can buy some of those thousands of different products that suit your particular condition. So we're way behind that at the moment in the UK, and we're coming down to different products with THC and CBD. So currently, we can use Sativex, which is a spray for MS spasticity, is what its license is. Nabilone, which is a synthetic THC. Why you want to prescribe a synthetic THC? Nabilone has a lot more side effects than the natural plant is beyond me. It's beyond me, my NICE recommended its usage, but that's a different discussion. And then we can use Epidiolex, which is effectively a CBD isolate, which is licensed for use with epilepsy, particularly for the children. But mainly what we're talking about is their licensed products, those 3, 4, if you count dronabinol, which is not licensed in the UK. We're looking now, it's legal for medical purposes. Actually, that number is slightly out of date now. There's 50 countries where whole plant cannabis is legal, and over half of the United States. And of course, CBD is legal, over-the-counter legal in the UK. CBD from hemp, which is how it comes into the UK and sold at Holland and Barrett and Boots and whatever. That's hemp-based. Hemp is Cannabis sativa, but it's grown over the years to be a tall, strong stem for other industrial purposes like rope and paper, shampoo, oils and such like. The hemp plants are wonderfully useful, but it also has CBD in it, but not much of the other cannabinoids. So the hemp you can get is hemp CBD is CBD, but it's not quite as useful medically because it hasn't got that richness of the other cannabinoids and terpenes in that the whole plant, the marijuana plant, if you like, has. But that's what we can get in this country. How do we take it? Very, very briefly, we can't recommend smoking it. We can't legally prescribe it for smoking, so that's out, I'm afraid. We can't smoke it. You can vape it, and about 50% of the prescriptions are now for vaping. Vaping, of course, is good because it has a fast action of onset, only lasts 2 or 3 hours, but people with pain find it very helpful for their pain, and a lot of people with chronic pain prefer vaping 2 or 3, 4 times a day than taking a background oil. Interestingly, they find that's a better for them. You get a stronger analgesic effect from a vape. So we can prescribe a vape. The ways we like are adjustable temperatures, and again, that's the final mechanism by which you get different cannabinoids. It depends on the temperature of the vape. So some cannabinoids boil or vaporize at different temperatures from others, and terpenes at different temperatures from others. So you can adjust the final product by adjusting the vape temperature, which is another complexity. So we've got to understand what vape to recommend and what temperature to vape at. That's the original vape. You can spray it. I'll go through these very quickly now. You can eat it. We can prescribe edibles. I don't think anyone has as yet. That's a slower onset of action, but it does last longer, 6 hours or so, but it's not very good bioavailability because of first pass metabolism. Lots of ways of eating it these days, particularly, of course, in the recreational communities, chocolate, beer, wine, you name it, and it's got CBD or THC in it these days. It's difficult to dissolve, but you can. There are ways to get it, not dissolve is the wrong word, but to get it at least suspended in water so you can drink it, because it's very lipophilic. It doesn't like water. You can put it on as a cream, which is very useful for localized pain, such as localized arthritis. It can come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes these days, but mainly we're prescribing oil, a simple oil. To drop under the tongue is the best way of taking it. It can come in other formats like suppositories or pessaries or patches on the skin, or you can encapsulate it. So there's lots of ways of giving it, but mainly we're down to vaping and oil. Quickly look at the clinical evidence as what's it helpful for. I think there's 5 things that are undoubtedly useful for. One is definitely pain, and why the Royal College of Physicians in its wisdom said you shouldn't use it for pain is completely beyond me. The evidence is overwhelming for pain. It is a painkiller. Number 2 is spasticity. We know that because some Sativex, MS spasticity. Number 3 is anxiety. That's mainly a CBD effect, not totally. You often need a little bit, tiny bit of THC for anti-anxiety effect. A bigger dose of THC is promote anxiety. So that's 3 is anxiety. Our clinic now is about 2/3 pain, about 20% anxiety, and whatever the rest is, about 20% the rest. Nausea and sickness, very, very potently good for nausea and sickness. Definitely evidence for that. And of course, epilepsy with the children, particularly evidence from Epidiolex, but it's also you get a better effect from the full extract products. You get a better statistical effect and less side effects if you don't use an isolate. So they're the 5 things. With moderate evidence we found for, and I say I did this report for the government about 4 years ago now. We found moderate evidence for appetite stimulation, fibromyalgia, sleep disorders. We found a little bit of evidence for things like glaucoma and bladder dysfunction, Tourette's, some motor aspects of Parkinson's disease, and for inflammatory bowel disease. That's quite a range of things that was some evidence for to varying degrees. We didn't find much evidence, interestingly, for some of these things. And depression's one worth pointing out because of that's the second commonest illegal use, medically speaking, is for depression. But there's very little evidence it helps depression, although that is beginning to emerge. And again, if I thought I was biased, this is the most definitive review, if you want to look it up, the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine in the States. And they came to the same, broadly speaking, the same conclusions as I did. I'll go over those quite quickly. Very briefly, I've nearly finished this part. Side effects. You've got to know what the side effects are of a drug. It's all very well knowing what it does. What does it do that you don't want? And it's very safe. CBD is remarkably safe. The side effects, such as they are from THC, really. And the 4 Ds, dizziness, drowsiness, dry mouth, and disorientation. This was a nice paper by Whiting, if you want to look it up. That gives you odds ratios for lots of different side effects. And you see the 4 Ds featuring there: disorientation, dizziness, drowsiness, and dry mouth. In the longer term, does it affect schizophrenia, psychosis? Yes, it almost certainly does exacerbate symptoms in people already suffering from a psychotic episode. It probably reduces the age of onset, and it's more likely in those who already had an episode or have a genetic predisposition, better say in their first-degree relatives. But the chances of that at the bottom 2 bullet points there are very small indeed. If it's prescribed sensibly and slowly escalating a THC dose, you don't get psychotic from it. And you wouldn't prescribe it with someone with active psychosis, clearly. You can get dependent on it, but this is street cannabis, 9% dependency. You shouldn't use it in someone with psychosis or schizophrenia, probably not mania. Bit controversial, cannabis use disorder. Can actually use CBD to get someone off a cannabis use disorder, and that's part of the Drug Sciences T21 program, is substance misuse as an eligible thing. And maybe you shouldn't use it immediately after stroke or heart attack or for any cardiac arrhythmia. But basically, otherwise, you can use it for most, it mixes with most medicines, and its side effect profile is really very positive, if that's the right word. So let's look at now how you can prescribe it. What's happened? The 1st of November 2018 was when the law changed. I was on holiday at that point, and I thought, that's it, job done, I can retire. But sadly, that wasn't the case, because it's been a bit of a damp squib since then. The NHS has prescribed 3 patients, 3. Privately, we're up to about 2,500 now. But of course, that's not particularly good because that's expensive for the patient, and we don't want that. So let's have a quick look at the UK regulations. To prescribe cannabis, it needs to be a product which contains cannabis. I thought I'd put that in because it's such a lovely governmental bureaucratic thing. That's sort of blooming obvious, really. It's got to be produced for medicinal use and sold as a medicinal product. Not very helpful, those regulations. It's used under the specials prescribing system. That's not routine because it's an unlicensed medicine. It has to be through the specials system, which is quite doable, but you just need, you take a bit more personal responsibility for the prescription. You have to prescribe it on different forms. There's no restrictions. That's not widely known. You can prescribe it for anything you like. It's not just pain or epilepsy or whatever. It's any condition. If you think it's in the best interest of the patients, you've taken into account the evidence, and you're comfortable about doing it within your own expertise, you can prescribe. That's very liberal. And we're probably the most liberal prescribing regime in Europe, actually. But at the moment, it's only doctors on the specialist register. That's hospital consultants. GPs or junior doctors can prescribe under the direction of a hospital consultant, which is a way around it. So GPs and junior staff can prescribe, but the vast majority don't. There's about 30 prescribing doctors in this country at the moment. And as I said already, we've done about 2,500 prescriptions and 3 in the NHS, which is pretty poor. Why? Ignorance. We need more teaching like this. That's one thing, and there are teaching facilities now, like that's the Academy is one example, but we need more teaching. Some would say there's a lack of evidence. I totally disagree with that. There's in excess of 20,000 published studies on the clinical evidence of efficacy of cannabis and side effects or whatever. Okay, that evidence is not in the form of double-blind placebo-controlled studies that people like NICE but there's a lot of evidence there, observational studies, case control studies, etc. I think we have plenty of evidence to prescribe and learn as we go along. There are fairly useless guidelines who've come out from the Royal College of Physicians, the British Paediatric Neurology Association, and NICE. I'm sorry to be robustly critical of those, but they are useless and were clearly written by people who didn't understand cannabis at all. They said, for example, Royal College of Physicians, no robust evidence of the use of cannabis in chronic pain, and the use is not recommended. That flies in the face of all the evidence and the 48 of the other 50 countries allowing it. So I don't know what they were thinking. Royal College of Physicians, I'll pass over that. BPNA were even worse. They said they shouldn't prescribe CBD. We're talking about CBD for epilepsy to any child, really. There's children like Alfie had 400 or 500 seizures a week who went to none. And that apparently is not good enough evidence for them. So I do find it quite astonishing that the BPNA is so hopelessly conservative. Never mind, I could prattle on for a long time about all this. Then there's NICE, I could prattle on even longer about, but they also said they shouldn't offer cannabis to manage chronic pain in adults. Do not offer CBD to manage chronic pain as part of a clinical trial. Again, flying in the face of the evidence. They said similar negative recommendations for epilepsy. They did say you could use Sativex, which was nice of them, and they did say you could use Nabilone, which is fairly useless, but you can use it for nausea and vomiting. So I disagree totally with NICE and have said so publicly. I just put that up because I think as students, perhaps you need to realize there are other ways of looking at evidence other than randomized controlled, placebo-controlled studies. That's the gold standard. I don't differ with that, but this is Sir Mike Rawlings, who was ex-chair of NICE and now chair of the MHRA. This is what he said. You can read it for yourselves. The appearance of RCTs at the top of the hierarchy is inappropriate. Hierarchy has illusory tools for assessing evidence. They should be replaced by a diversity of approaches that involve analyzing the totality of the evidence base. And we're now talking a lot about real-world evidence. You look at the real-world evidence, and it's pretty overwhelming that cannabis is useful. I'm not going to say it's a cure-all. It's not totally safe, but it's really useful for a lot of chronic conditions for which nothing much else helps. Well, again, it's an unlicensed medicine. Some doctors don't like that. You have to take a bit more personal responsibility, but it's remarkably safe. You can't kill anyone with it. There's a lot of bureaucracy with it, sadly, and money, no doubt, will feature into this, though there's no decent health economic study that shows if you prescribe cannabis, you prescribe less of other things like opioids, anti-epilepsy drugs, anti-anxiety drugs, less physiotherapy for people back into work, for example. Surprisingly, there's no overarching health economic study that I think will show you can introduce cannabis at pretty well zero net cost, but no one's done that work yet. So how do you become a cannabis physician? The last 10 minutes or so. I think you need to be bold. I think there's a lot of doctors now which have saddened me, I have to say, that aren't really, have said to many patients, I'd like to prescribe cannabis, but I can't because my hospital doesn't allow me. And there's a lot of, I don't think that's right. I went into doctoring to hopefully do the right thing by the patients and not the right thing for yourself, your career, your employer, your ego, your OBE, whatever it is. I think you need to do the right thing for your patients and push for this to be on the formularies and don't take no for an answer. At the moment, there's very few doctors who are prepared to do that. So I'd like to think that those I'm talking to go out, get qualified, those who if you aren't, and then be bold about this. Do we need a new specialty of cannabis medicine? Some would say yes, some would say no. Yeah, there's probably too many different specialties. It would be very difficult to get it accepted by the establishment. I think if we open prescribing to GPs, which I'm very in favor of, then that would get round the problem that we have at the moment of being specialists who only know about that specialism and not about cannabis. But there is a case for cannabis as a specialty. Of course, there's a lack of understanding of plant medicine. It does require a different medical therapeutic approach. It's very much a bit of a trial and error process. And you also have to know a lot about a lot of conditions. So it's a bit like a sort of specialist GP, if you like. You have to know about pain, epilepsy, anxiety. So it crosses the traditional specialty boundaries. So I think they could make a case for a cannabis specialty. So I think the jury's out on that. But personally, I think I don't think it will happen, but I think probably it would be a good thing if it did. So how do we prescribe cannabis? If you're, first of all, at this moment, most of the people I'm talking to are a few years off this, I'm sorry to say. If you're the GMC specialist consultant, you can prescribe, as I've said, but you can share with the senior the prescribing as a follow-up. Generally, GMC are not interested in doing this unless if you're aware of the misuse of drugs regulations, good awareness of the guidelines, aware of the evidence base for that particular treatment, prescribing with their own expertise, you can just prescribe it. There's not an issue about that. So what would we suggest? We suggest find a supportive community. This, again, I know this is a year or so ahead, but I would like to think that people would be interested now. What I'd like to suggest is, I mentioned earlier, is join the Medical Cannabis Clinicians Society. I would say that as I'm chairman, but medical students can join it free. That's the website there. And I'd like to, really would like to set up a medical students branch or arms. If anyone's really interested in that, please email me or go through Drug Science or whatever. There's an email, my email's at the end of this talk. So join a supportive community, basically, and the only supportive community at the moment is the Medical Cannabis Clinicians Society. Familiarize yourself with the guidelines. You've got to do that. You've got to know what the guidelines say in order, even if it's only to then ignore them. Now, the main guidelines are the RCP, NICE, a little bit from the Royal College of GPs, and there's the British Pediatric Neurologists, but also guidance, the one in the middle there, recommendations, guidance on medical cannabis under prescription, is from the Medical Cannabis Clinicians Society. And I think that's very good. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I think it is. So be aware of the guidelines. Get some training, and there's online training. Look at the our website, the Medical Cannabis Clinicians Society website. There's training there, not just, there's some very good training from some of the sponsors of the producers. Kieron, for example, in the bottom right-hand corner there, is a very good training program, which will have to be non-promotional, so they can't promote their products, which is a good thing. And the society is wanting to develop its own training program. I wouldn't, to be honest, look at NHS England. It's fairly useless. I hope I haven't upset anyone on this talk, but it's not very good. We can get face-to-face training. I do face-to-face training once a month with doctors. I've now trained about 60, about 30 which are now prescribing. And there's an evidence base going to appear on the website soon, probably in the new year. So you can just type in whatever you want and look at the evidence for that particular condition. So learn about the products. There's not time to do that today, but there's now about 12 producers in the country with products available. And that's changing literally every month. Prices are coming down, the range is going up, and what we can prescribe and how we can prescribe it is becoming more diversified month to month. It's really a fascinating field to be in. At the moment, it's all imported, which is a shame. I think we need a UK medical cannabis industry because it's all imported at the moment. Find a suitable premises. Now, this is perhaps a little bit, there may be some people who can do this at the moment on this talk. I know some of you won't be able to. You need a premises. You can do this in the NHS. Hopefully, when you've qualified, you can do this on the NHS. But at the moment, it's only private effectively. And to do that, you do need to be in a CQC registered premises. That's basically a private hospital or the Nuffield or the Spire, whatever it is. You can do it in your front room. But then you have to get your own CQC approval, which is a process I would not recommend. It aged me about 10 years when I did it. So you do need to probably at the moment, go through a medical cannabis clinic, one of the private clinics. And perhaps some people who do qualify soon are already qualified. We do want follow-up people in these clinics. So we want people to help us prescribe because the consultants having their time filled up now with follow-ups. So we want them to see the new people, and we want junior doctors or GPs to do the follow-ups now, because that's the only way we can cope. Apply if you've got to apply for a pink pad. That sounds exciting, doesn't it? But you can only prescribe privately controlled drugs, and it's a controlled drug. If you get this pink pad, that takes about 2 months, 3 months to get. It's called a CD, controlled drug FP10. That's a bit of a pain, but it's easily done once you know where to do it. And all this is in writing if you want to get there. Get to know the specialist prescribing system in your locality. And then review. Insurance companies generally say this is fine, but some have said no, you can't be covered for insurance if you're prescribing cannabis. So we have now, the society has links with a new cannabis insurer called through Towergate, so we can get insurance if that's an issue for some of you. And then start seeing patients, basically. It's a least difficult process, and I think the important thing is to get mentoring afterwards. So share your experience with others. So the society has a sort of closed forum. Most of the clinics have their own clinical governance and mentoring systems. And indeed, we're not allowed to prescribe de novo. We have to get that prescription approved by our colleagues. Say in the clinics, we have to get 2 other doctors to approve the prescription. But mentoring afterwards, as it's a new sort of medicine, is really important. So don't just get a training course, but get some sort of ongoing mentoring once you're able to prescribe. I've nearly finished. This is another plea to join the Medical Cannabis Clinicians Society with our guidelines. We produce prescribers guides, we produce things for patients, CBD, there's a formulary so you know what's available. We provide roadshows, and we do a lot with drug science, and we're pleased to do that. We had some roadshows before COVID came along. So I would encourage people to join the society, if I may be so bold. And that's our own prescribing guide for those who want to know in practical terms how to get into this field. And I've virtually finished. This is what I'd like to see eventually. I'd like to see proper cannabis dispensaries like any high street pharmacy, but people there, bud tenders they're called in Canada and the States, who really know a lot about the different sorts of cannabis. You can see all the different varieties here. This is in Seattle, I think it was. People who know what they're talking about. And of course, it's a bit different there because it's recreationally legal. So you still need a lot of guidance. I think we're a few years off being recreationally legal in the UK. I think it will be with us within 4 to 5 years, but we don't know. That's what I'd like to see eventually, is knowledgeable doctors with knowledgeable pharmacists treating knowledgeable patients with a whole variety of conditions. And some of these are great places like Apple stores and things, as you know, it's totally mainstream, and it's time we got totally mainstream. The last time I'm going to put up a slide on Trump, because hopefully he'll have gone soon. So I hope I just haven't offended somebody there, but this is what he actually said. And I think there's no doubt with Biden that it will become federally legal, which is federally illegal in the States. And as soon as the importance of that for us is we'll see a rush of products into the UK with all these different varieties and subtleties I've hinted at. And I think over the next, probably by the end of 2021, we'll have a much broader range of products that we can actually prescribe and advise our patients to take. And I'd like to see. So what I'd like to see eventually is under the new Biden presidency. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is that.